a lot of this weight just like slowly kind of lifted off my shoulders, and a lot of this subconscious fear that somehow she was going to be able to kind of wiggle her way out of any accountability slowly lifted. Yeah, so I was able to speak to the DA a little bit that evening, and he informed me that the likelihood of her getting maximum sentencing is incredibly high. That she's most likely going to be getting the 60 years.
Wow, that we were wondering that because again, 15 years is the max on
Yeah,
each charge. And look, the way that we understand it as well, from Utah law is it really isn't the judge who sets it. It's more like this is what punishment is, and it's up to a board to determine if shall or be granted parole. So, I mean, that's our
yeah,
understanding about it.
yeah. So he also told me that it's about 8 months from now that that board will be put together, and that's gonna be, like, the first parole hearing will be in in as little as 8 months,
Yeah.
and that's what we're gonna be focusing like, what the DA said to be focusing on, like, having a written statement of harm and, showing up to those hearings, and hopefully that this after this first one, that it will be pushed years down the line.
Well, first of all, were you there when she pled guilty, and do you plan to appear at her sentencing?
I was not there, I didn't want to be there, um or at least I was pretty torn on whether I wanted to be there or not. I won't be there for her sentencing simply because of just the timing of it. I'll be in Europe. Um, I would have liked to be there for the sentencings. I will be there for the parole hearing, most likely. That's I think where a lot of victims like that's the important time for the victims to come forward and to convince the board that she doesn't deserve any sort of parole.
I thought it was really interesting when you said that it didn't seem genuine, her reason for pleading guilty. Obviously, from
Oh,
a legal point of view, there's a number of reasons why I think she did it. You had Ruby Franke agreeing to testify against her. Evidence looks really bad, but
that right there.
you don't believe in any way she feels bad about what happened.
Not even a little bit. No, that was it's so wild because something that she would constantly, um, accuse me of when I was living with her. So when the abuse started getting really bad, people at my in my church started noticing that I didn't look well and that something was wrong. And, they started talking to the bishop or the pastor, the person in charge of our ward, um, just like their concerns. And the bishop, Bishop Bangader, told Jodi these people's names, and then we would go to their home, and she would coach me in the car and tell me exactly what I was going to say, and then she would go in with me, and I would have to apologize to them for manipulating them into feeling sorry. I believed that Jesus was working through Jodi, and that Jodi was saving me, and so it's just darkly darkly ironic that watching her in the pews, like, at the sentencing, just, like, looking so sad and then telling, like, her attorney coming out and saying something like that is just like, "Wow, oh, you're manipulating all that time you were telling me that that's what I was doing was just a projection because that's what you would do and are doing." Like, it's like, you don't get accused and convicted of child torture, and then suddenly are like, "Oh, I just really care about these children's healing." Like, that's not what happens.
Yeah,
You don't go 15 years of having this be a pattern and then suddenly be like, "I just really care about these children." That's not possible.
and I wanted to ask you about that because now that the plea agreements have been entered, these court documents have been filed, and we now
Yeah,
know more details about what happened to these kids. I mean, talking about Jodi Hildebrandt, as I mentioned earlier
yeah,
on in the show, she either physically forced or coerced a 9-year-old girl, Eve, to jump into a cactus multiple times. These two children were dehydrated. They weren't given food. They were made to work outside in the heat.
yeah.
Did it seem worse what happened to these kids, or just eerily similar to what you went through?
So a lot of it was similar. There were certain specifics that were not. I went on News Nation to give a statement right after the plea, and I didn't know about the cactus, and they had spoken about it right before they brought me on, and it was horrifying to hear about. Not surprising, but horrifying nonetheless. She, again, she's one of the most convincing, powerful humans you will ever meet. And when you are in a state of vulnerability, especially as a child, there's just, she can convince you of anything. I mean, I worked out in her garden in the middle of the summer. Like, we didn't live in southern Utah, so it was not as hot, or as dry. But I was working out in her yard all summer, and she used withholding food, withholding water as a way of force. Um, I mean, she would, she'd duct tape me and tied me up, but I was also a teenager. There's a very big difference between being 16 and going through something like this and being a 9-year-old. Like, there's just no way of comparing those two things.
It was horrifying. For me, I think it was worse than I even imagined. I mean, talking about
Yeah.
just the injury sustained, what these kids went through, not even the physical trauma, the emotional, mental trauma
The
as well.
emotional,
And you've talked about that as well.
yes, the emotional and spiritual abuse. I mean, it took me, I mean, I'm still in
Yep.
therapy every week for it. There's no, and again, it was almost 15 years ago, and I'm still daily, like, I mean, through this experience for months, there's been a tremendous amount of healing on my end, um, which just goes to show how important accountability is for the victims.
Right.
Um, but no, I mean, this doesn't, the invisibility of harm almost, it makes it even worse, because if those kids didn't have those horrifying physical marks on their bodies, would this ever have been intervened?
Yeah, I mean, like I think about that. Whether if Russell never escaped, what would have happened? Look, I know we have to let you go, but I did want to ask you real quickly about something that really
Yeah.
struck me and how this all went down. Is that Ruby Franke pled guilty. She was going to testify against Jodi Hildebrandt, but her lawyers, right before the plea agreement, before the plea hearing, they released this statement, and I read it in part, and it says, again, initially, Miss Franke believed that Jodi Hildebrandt had the insight to offer a path to continual improvement. Miss Hildebrandt took advantage of this quest and twisted it into something heinous. Over an extended period, Miss Hildebrandt systematically isolated Ruby Franke from her extended family, older children, and her husband, Kevin Franke. This prolonged isolation resulted in Miss Franke being subjected to a distorted sense of morality, shaped by Miss Hildebrandt's influence. What is your reaction to Ruby Franke throwing Jodi
No,
Hildebrandt under the bus and was going to testify against her?
yeah, no, it's hearing that Ruby was going to testify against Jodi just shows me that they had a lot more on Jodi. Like, the fact that Jodi got off on only 4 counts of child abuse, which is significant, and in my opinion, nothing compared to what they probably had on her. Um, and as I want to say that Ruby is an adult. Ruby is the mother, she is responsible for her children, and she is responsible for what happens to her children. Full stop. And I fully agree. Like, I can completely understand where he is coming from in that statement. I don't agree with her not having responsibility. She deserves every one of those counts of child abuse. Um, but Jodi is one of the most manipulative, and it is systematic. And I know that the last time that I was on here, I talked about that, how it was with me. It's like line upon line, precept upon precept conditioning. It's like you're this frog being boiled alive in water so slowly that you don't realize it's happening until it's already happened.
Jessi, before I let you go, one last quick question. You mentioned
Yeah.
what the prosecutor said could be a potential sentence for Jodi Hildebrandt, the maximum. Did the prosecutor give you any indication about what the potential sentence for Ruby Franke would be?
I didn't ask, honestly.
Right.
Just that's not the connection I have
Sure.
to this case.
I gotcha. Jessi Hildebrandt, again, thank you so much for coming on. So sorry
pleasure.
again for everything that you've gone through and you're continuing to go through, especially as this case became so national and became on the forefront and the conversation developed about it. But again, thank you so much for your bravery to come on, speak about what happened, and we wish you the best of luck as this case progresses.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
All right, everybody, that is all we have for you right now here on Sidebar. Thank you so much for joining us. Please subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Jesse Weber. Speak to you next time.